Well, I've been asked to give this talk today because I'm one of the small number of Australian astronomers who are openly gay. And so what I wanted to do today is really tell a personal story about, the experiences I've had in my life, and just some of them, both good and bad, and to try and help people understand the sorts of things they can do in their lives to make the environment, the work environment, the environment, people around you more comfortable with who they are. So I'll just give you some background on my story and then talk about some practical advice for things you can do to make things better for everyone. So general ground rules, I suppose. I'm speaking for myself here. I don't represent Team Gay or anything. There's an estimated third of a billion people in the world who aren't heterosexual. And I can't speak for those people. So the words and the stories I choose are my own. And for you, this is a public event. I'm standing here on a big stage, so if you tweet things, tweet these things. Feel free to ask me questions, take photos, whatever you want. So let's start with gender. So this is me. Look familiar? When I was a kid, I didn't understand gender. I really didn't. I basically grew up as a boy, and I didn't feel that anything female, anything traditionally, girls' toys, girls' clothes, girls' interests, I wasn't interested. I just felt 100% like, that's not for me, that stuff's not for me. This is me standing with my favourite footballer, this guy, Harry Grady, played for Arsenal in the 1990s, and this was just me all over. So when I was a kid, I was sort of unselfconsciously happy with playing football with boys or running with guys, and I just, age 10, I just felt I was one of its pack. I didn't feel like I was the only girl there. I just felt completely different. So that's kind of how I grew up, and I'm very lucky that my parents were very supportive of me. The way I dressed, they didn't sort of try and put me in dresses and that kind of stuff. My mum gave up on that at the age of 6 when I started playing war games and said these bunches in my hair are getting in the way and that kind of stuff. So essentially my parents are so supportive of me. And the way I felt about myself. So, my friends were also very supportive. These are, the sort of stuff I was doing, playing judo and hanging out with spiky hair and denim jackets in the 1980s. Very cool. And, my friends totally accepted the way I was. There was no bullying. I was never bullied by kids. There was no question, you're a tomboy, you should do this, you should do that. But in fact, the first sort of inkling I got that people didn't accept the way I was actually from adults. This letter came home from school when I was age 10. So this is dated September 1990, and it's from the head teacher of my school, Elizabeth Harvey-Smith, who is my mum, by the way. And it said, "Dear parents, Lisa has been selected to represent the school at the local football rally," etc. Here's the details. Okay, that's pretty normal. Yeah, okay, like football. And at the bottom here it says, "Let's hope common sense prevails and the children are allowed to play." What does that mean? Well, this is our football team at primary school, so these stick like prepubescent figures are the team. And oh look, there's 2 girls on the team. That's me and that's Peter Fletcher. Peter with an A. So this is our football team. And the local authority had such a problem with there being 2 girls in our primary school football team that they banned us from all the tournaments. So this is the first time we had to actually go. My mum fought tooth and nail to try and allow us to play, but in the end she failed because the local authority was so sexist and ridiculous. So we had to actually go and play in a different district across the border in Suffolk with teams from schools miles away because we couldn't play in football tournaments. So this is kind of one of my first tastes of the ridiculousness of society with respect to these sort of things. The second thing was quite soon after that, when I was about 11, I was due to go to secondary school. So I looked around the local schools, and the school uniform policy troubled me greatly because in my head I was a little boy, really, and so wearing a skirt would be the most ridiculously horrific thing for me. And I couldn't have done it. It would be like asking most boys to wear a skirt to school. So I decided that I didn't want to go to school because I couldn't do that. I couldn't wear the school uniform. So essentially that made the decision for me. and I decided to be educated at home. And just a tiny, tiny change in those rules, the football rule, the school uniform policy would have made a massive, massive difference to my life. Not necessarily unhappy that I learnt at home, I actually really enjoyed it. It was a positive experience for me. But those sort of tiny things that can be so simple to fix can make a massive difference to people who don't fit in boxes. And I was one of those people. So when God handed out the cake, I got a big slice of rainbow cake. And it's yummy, but it's not always been a piece of cake growing up as gay in the 1990s and 1980s in the UK. And the reason for that is kind of like what Min just said, you can't be what you can't see. And these were my role models as a kid. Growing up, prisoner cell block age, that was the only lesbianism in the whole world that existed. And this camp character on Are You Being Served was the only gay male who was sort of on our television screens. Ridiculous, stereotypical role models. And there was only one actual real human being. Thank God for Martina, because I literally had no knowledge of a single human being on planet Earth who was gay apart from myself whilst I was growing up, if it wasn't for Martina. So thank you. If I ever met her, I'd just say thank you. And this is the sort of stuff I have to look at all the time. And that's not nice. It's kind of negative stuff. It's just drip, drip, drip all the time. And it doesn't help you, and it's not healthy. I don't think I need to say much more about that. So it was difficult for me, and it's difficult for a lot of people for these reasons: the social stigma, the fear of bullying, the fear of marginalisation. Those are real things. Those are real things that affect us. And as I said, I was never directly bullied as a kid. I was never called names. I was never excluded. It was those adult things, the societal things, that actually made it tricky for me. And seeing the marginalisation in terms of laws, seeing public scrutiny on my rights to do things, and just the lack of role models really was tricky. So, in fact, the easiest part was coming out to my parents because they're wonderful people. So skip forward a few years, I met a girl, fell in love. I was 17, and I said, "Oh, let's telephone." And she was like, "Oh no, I'm not sure." I said, "Why?" So my mum wouldn't react very well. I said, "Why not?" Apparently, the auntie had gone to a tea leaf reader or a palm reader or something, and the palm reader said, "Oh, there's someone gay in your family," and the mum had flipped out, so she wouldn't let us come out for a while. But eventually, she persuaded. She decided to tell my mum, and then I could tell my parents. And telling my parents was very, very easy. I said to my dad, "Dad, I've got something to tell you." He said, "Okay, what is it?" And I said, "You know, so-and-so, well, she's my girlfriend. I'm gay." He said, "Oh, that's great, darling. Do you want a cup of tea?" And literally it happened. And my mum was pretty similar. She was like, "Oh, darling, I've known you since she was 7. So it really wasn't surprising. Not traumatic at all. Very, very happy day. And that was 17 years ago this month. And do you know what? It's the little things that matter, the little things. And this community is great because, you know, most colleagues just don't blink an eyelid. It means so much when people just don't care. And you just say, "My partner, blah, blah, blah." "Oh, okay, yeah, my partner, this, that, and the other." You're just talking in a normal way. Nobody cares. That's wonderful. And I want to just thank everyone for being amazing about that, because you grew up with that stuff as well, the bad stuff. You grew up seeing negative imagery and without seeing, you know, regular gay people just out there doing stuff. So, you know, it means a lot. And it means a lot when someone challenges homophobic behaviour or attitudes, and that's happened at my workplace. You know, I was in a telescope site, and some people were making some horrible comments. And I was kind of away from my colleagues, and there are, and someone stood up, and it was a guy who I wouldn't expect to stand up. You know, he was head to toe fluoro, big muscly guy, and you know, I judged him, but he didn't judge me. He stood up to this guy and said, "Oh look, I've got a gay mate, he's fine." this guy shut up. And, it just takes one person to stand up. It really means so much. And there are also other structures. There are formal structures, ways that you, as a person who is yourself same-sex attracted, or someone who's heterosexual, and just is a supporter of people, whoever they are, and you want to stand up and say, look, I'm an ally, I'm a supporter, and I'll go through a few of those things. These are the little things in life that matter, and it really means so much to me personally when people include me in the same way that they include other people. To make it difficult with jokes, it hardly ever happens, but sometimes people make jokes and think, oh, it's not really cool, just kind of think. And assumptions, it kind of makes it awkward when people say, so are you married? And to me that's pointing out the fact that I can't get married and also embarrassing me. So it just makes it awkward for everyone. So the way that you phrase things can be important. And all these things have happened at work. What does your husband do? That kind of stuff. It's an assumption you don't need to make. It's better to just be gender neutral, and those are relatively minor things for you to adjust, for us all to think about the way we address people in a neutral sense and not assuming things about them, whoever they are. So why tell everyone? Why do I want to be out of the closet? It's quite difficult, clearly, from the tone of my voice. Well, the first thing is that studies, Gallup polls have been done in the US, this is from 2009, and there's a big difference in people's attitudes to gay rights if they personally know a gay or lesbian person, or if they don't personally know a gay or lesbian person. So dark green on this chart indicates support for gay marriage. So for people who don't know anyone gay or lesbian themselves, the support for gay marriage is only 27%. For people who do know personally someone who's gay or lesbian, support jumps to 49%. And there are lots and lots of these similar questions, and they're all very similar answers. The people who personally know gay or lesbian people are much more likely to support these things. And people who vote for conservative-style political parties are far less likely to personally know someone who's gay or lesbian. So being out of the closet is actually very important to me for that reason. And also for myself, living openly and honestly is important, because if you don't do that, it causing me a lot of stress. And I also want to be a positive role model for other people. So what's the importance of allies? Allies are really important. Allies are people who listen without judgment, and they don't speak for you, but they speak up for you. So the good way you can be an ally, if you are in a same-sex relationship yourself, you can just be open about it if you want to, if you feel comfortable. Put a picture of your family on your desk at work. You don't know how many students will come in your office and think, oh wow, I've got an ally, I've got a point of contact, I've got someone who understands me, someone I'm not afraid to talk to. That could be a really powerful thing. And if you're not in a same-sex relationship, or if whoever you are, it doesn't matter, you can learn how to be an ally. It's important. There are ally networks, there are badges you can put on your door or on your website or on the first page of your talks or lectures to show that you're a supporter. But it's also important not to just put the badge there, but to actually educate yourself about the issues. So there are issues for lesbian, gay, bisexual people that are different from the transgender and intersex community. And there are lots of books available and websites available so that you can read up on the types of issues that you should be aware of before you put yourself out there as an ally. So it's a very powerful thing we can all do. I think I need to do better at that as well, because there's a number of ways in which you can actually really help people, touch people, and reach out to them. And just finally, just talk about networks. So networks really matter. There's, it's a fact in my life that knowing other people who are non-heterosexual, or gender diverse, knowing people personally reduces a feeling of marginalization or aloneness or separateness. So that's been really important for me throughout my life, and I wish when I was younger I'd had more connection with people, especially people who I looked up to and educated me. And there's a new professional network at CSIRO called GLBTI at CSIRO, so for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex members of CSIRO. It's a very new network, but it's actually been endorsed by Megan Clark, the chief executive. And that's a real powerful statement. So I'm not sure if Megan's here right now, but I think that's really important as a chief executive to particularly support that sort of initiative. I hope that grows to allow people to be their whole self at work. And as I said, I've had so many positive experiences with people in this room, and it's a great community, but I think we can all be slightly more proactive, including myself, to make sure that those good intentions are really communicated across the community. So students and other people, members of staff, feel more comfortable in the environment. So I'm really kind of a rally cry to be more proactive, to educate yourself about things you can do to support others in the community, and get involved. So thank you so much for listening. And I'll see you later.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for sharing that with us and making us very much more aware, I think, of those issues that you raised. Questions? Stone. All right. Yes, sorry.
In his class, there were 2 women and their daughter was also in there. And the mum came in and said, I hear that there was a discussion today about mum and I'm going to dad. So what's it? I thought about it. So I asked him about it. And he said, oh, yeah, we can chat about that. I said, do you know that Molly is a vegetarian?
That's great. Yeah. It's always the adults. It's always the adults.
Okay.
My son's got a very good option on it, and they asked me to take a sleepover. Because I did a long way away, I said yes. They said, well, I've had a sleepover too. I don't know, when we set up drinking till 3 a.m. It's my best experience I had. Thanks, Lisa. That was fantastic. And I was really interested in both panels and the speakers. What's that representation? I would present those. I think it's really important that museums and other organisations on board with that, making sure that they're not always presenting what's the spirit of who is behind astronomy, what they're doing, who they are as people. The scientists, I was working in the Natural History Museum. One of the big emphasis was the people behind the science and doing exactly what you're saying. How can you be what you can't see? It's really a very, for me, that's the most important, really strong point.
Well, let's take this again. Indeed, thank both Lisa and for 2 what I thought were very inspirational stories. So it's now time to pass on to the person who's going to chair the next session. The next session is sponsored by Castro, and the chair is Brian Gainser, who is the outgoing director of Castro. And I'd just like to use this as an opportunity to acknowledge the fantastic job Brian has done as the director of Castro. You'll be very much missed, but of course we'd love to see you back in Australia.
Thanks, Warwick. Like the AAO, Castro's been very proud and excited to be a supporter of these events since inception. I really think that it's amazing. It's just been a real sea change in Australian astronomy that a bunch of different groups and people have around the same time realised this is an issue. And it's amazing just how it's changed the whole tone of astronomy in Australia and how many other fields are looking very closely at what we're doing and starting to ask themselves the same kind of questions that we are. We're now going to move from astronomy to political science and social science. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Gillian Whitehouse, who's in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland, and she does her research on gender equity, on pay gaps, and on parental leave. So she hasn't just written papers in this area, but she's also been quite influential in writing reports and providing advice to the Productivity Commission and other government groups. So please welcome Professor Whitehouse.
Thank you. It's so hard to follow those compelling personal stories. It's really nice to hear those. But yeah, thanks very much for inviting me along to the workshop. It's a great pleasure to be here, just in part because of the allure of astronomy to outsiders. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but so many people are saying, I'm going to the Women in Astronomy workshop. Oh, wow, lucky you. And I just hope that some of our conversation out of the workshop can be about the stuff you actually do. But obviously, because of the subject matter for these 2 days, so until recently, really the limits of my knowledge on this issue in astronomy was that story about Jocelyn Bell and the Nobel Prize that wasn't back in the 1970s. But it's really clear to me from the material that's been circulated about this workshop and all the data out there about the representation and careers of women in astronomy that you're doing an enormous amount in this area, and that's really highlighted in what I've heard today. So given all that you're doing, I have this niggling worry. What can I contribute, actually, to this? So I hope I can just flag some issues that will be thoughts from slightly different angles and try and give you a taste of some recent statistics I've been working on that speak to that, these issues a little bit. So just first of all, taking the lead for some recent sociological work on what was come to be called the stalled gender revolution, I want to raise the argument that a crucial step at this stage is to recognise changes that need to take place for men. So I know this is a Women in Astronomy workshop, but this is an observation that reflects the work of, in particular, of an American sociologist, Paula England, and a Danish sociologist, Josta Esping Andersen, among many others. But it's essentially the observation that, on the one hand, there's been a great deal of change in, well, perhaps since the middle of the last century, in the way that women live their lives. So what we've seen might be termed a masculinisation of women's lives. So compared with the situation in the mid-20th century in terms of their participation in paid employment, including in a whole range of previously male-dominated occupations, and also more broadly in the public sphere, in brackets, still a long way to go, of course. But comparing that with, on the other hand, there's been much less change in the way men live their lives. So not as much change in the extent to which men have engaged with the domestic sphere of household labour, or even made major moves into traditionally female-dominated occupations. So think perhaps of primary education, or areas like that. Such observations lead to the call for an equivalent feminisation of men. So I don't want to scare you guys with that term, but really essentially just the closer engagement of men in parenting, sharing of care in the labour force and the household, and the idea that that's the main social change we need now if we're going to restart the gender revolution. So, obviously, the second point about the impact of parenthood follows on from that, because a lot of people would argue that parenthood is that time in people's lives where the risk is that you're going to consolidate more traditional forms of family arrangements, what we might call the male breadwinner form of a family arrangement. And yeah, we're well aware there's heaps of research out there about the labour market benefits to men of parenthood, so men typically earn a premium as fathers compared with non-parents, whereas women, you have the opposite situation. So, all right, so that's two things, thinking about men, thinking about the impact of parenthood, and then I guess another thing I bring as someone from a School of Political Science where we talk about public policies a lot is a kind of reflection on the policy debates. So there's a whole world out there of fervent research on work-family policies. This is just a burgeoning area of social research. And there's a lot of critical analysis of policies and their limits and their contradictory possibilities. So, for a start, policies might be unavailable or difficult to access. That's one sort of problem. Or they might potentially be less accessible to fathers than to mothers. But another issue is that if you do have them and you do use them, there might be a sting in the tail. So there's a lot of talk about the penalties, the potential penalties of accessing work-family policies. One example of that's the flexibility stigma. So you access those sorts of policies, well, you're labelled in a certain sort of way. That's not to your advantage in terms of career. And just that overall potential for perverse outcomes that links in with that. So policies might accessing policies might stall women's careers and kind of consolidate rather than challenge gender divisions of labour. And then finally, one other lens that I bring to this is from studying academic employment. And I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind, and it was mentioned in Sarah's talk, is the really dramatic changes that are happening in academic employment. So that's partly the expansion of what we call research-only positions, which are predominantly fixed-term positions, so they're not continuing positions. And also now we have teaching-focused positions as well, although that's at this stage a smaller proportion overall. But take those two together, and the proportion of that, of academic employment that's in that core teaching and research continuing positions has shrunk dramatically over the last 10 years or so. So that's a bit of a worry. It affects both men and women, but if what we're thinking about for women is their increasing, a kind of pipeline effect through which women are gradually entering academia more, and we are seeing greater advancement of women to higher levels in academia. There's a question about what these kinds of changes mean for the viability of that sort of pipeline effect. So that's a bit of background there for you. Just quickly note then that I'm going to now turn to some data, and that slide gives you a bit of information on a recent survey that I've done with some colleagues. So I'm just acknowledging those colleagues there and giving you some basic data on the surveys that were done and their response rates, and also acknowledging the work of Michelle Messick, who I've worked with in looking at some of this data. I should say that the analysis of these data sets are work in progress. So I'll give you some preliminary information here. Quick background to start with, in the interest of speeding through this. So a basic overview of women's representation at higher career levels in academia, and broken into broad disciplinary categories. I'd love to be able to break science down into astronomy and other areas for you, but I'm afraid our sample doesn't do that. I can break science down a little more finely, but once I get further down the talk, that leaves me with too few numbers to talk about. So I've just left it together there, but what you can see there are the obvious things that I know you know, and they're that everywhere there's a decrease in the proportion of women from level A through to level E. That science has a lower proportion of women at all those levels. And actually, I can show it to you like this as well, science actually has the largest fall in proportion of women from A to E. Another bit of background information here is the percentage of academic staff with at least one dependent child by gender and academic level. And you see there, unsurprisingly, that there's a higher proportion of men than women are parents in academic employment, and that this difference generally widens with career level. Well, on that slide, you see the biggest gap at level D, which suggests that perhaps that step from C to D is where barriers occur for women who are parents in academia. The picture for science is reasonably similar. I haven't given you that separately. All right, so here's on from the descriptives to thinking about this, these issues a little more analytically. So I've noted two questions there. The first one's how junior academics at level A and C view their prospects of career advancement, and asking questions about whether that varies by parenthood, by gender, discipline, role and contract type, which are those changes I was talking about before. And then a second question about what influences getting to the professoriate, so levels D and E, and same questions about what might influence that. So I'm going to give you a basic overview of a couple of logistic regression models that look at these two things in turn, and I've just listed for you a range of variables there that go into these models. Quick overview of how junior academics view their prospects. So they were asked about their perceptions of advancement within the next 5 years. So what you can see there is that teaching and research staff were around 1.5 times more likely than those in teaching intensive roles, which was our reference category, to expect to be at a higher level in 5 years' time. And there was no difference for the research-only category. Having a continuing contract was highly significant, so again, 1.5 times more likely for continuing versus fixed-term staff. And what was possibly interesting for this workshop, discipline did matter, and junior academics were more hopeful of career advancement in all of the other listed disciplines compared with the reference category of science. So they know something. Parenthood was actually positively associated with perceptions of prospects for advancement. So perhaps it is that as a parent you're a bit more determined, got more of a commitment to that. And gender wasn't significant. So what that's saying is at this level, there isn't a difference. It's not that women don't want to advance in their careers or have other ideas about what they should be doing. They suggest that gender isn't a factor at that stage on that question. But what about actually getting there? So again, we see really strong effects of role type. So teaching and research status made you 4.5 times more likely to be in the professoriate. Remember, in this we're controlling for age and time in academia and similar issues than teaching in intensive status. Having a continuing or tenurable contract was highly significant. Again, a large effect there. Discipline mattered again, and in this case, not across all the disciplines, but certainly compared with the medical and health discipline, which is quite is very female dominated in the breakdown that I'm using, and business and law compared with the reference category of science. So much more likely to make it to those levels in those two disciplines compared with science. And here, the effect of gender in parenthood is a little more complex. Gender on its own mattered. There was a positive effect of being male. And parenthood on its own mattered. There was a positive effect of being a parent. But when we interact gender and parenthood, those effects are subsumed. And the analysis essentially shows that having children really doesn't do anything to men's likelihood of being at levels D and E, but it reduces women's likelihood of being at those levels. So perhaps that's not a surprising result to people. Quick summary there of those results. So I don't think I need to repeat those. We'll cover all that. They're just there as a summary. Conscious of time. So moving on then, just quickly to finish up, I want to talk a bit about those issues of policies and support and people's sense of the support of their institution. So drawing on a few of the questions from our survey, and I put the question at the bottom, here I'm focusing on this question. In the last 5 years, to what extent have the following helped you in advancing your career or been a problem for you? And these are responses to the item, the attitude within this university towards people with family responsibilities. So what you can see there is, I think, I've got a little circle to highlight. I've done this both for all disciplines and then for science, but it's not a great deal of difference. But what I think is interesting about those results is that fathers, 2/3 of fathers, tended not to see this as an issue. There's a much smaller percentage of mothers didn't see it as a help or a problem. Like mothers were more inclined to see a problem than a help in both, or in total and in science, perhaps a little more so in science. But the way we've been thinking about these results is as a kind of evidence of the prevalence of male breadwinner norms. I think that it's not really men's problem. It's not really father's problem, whether the institution's supportive or not. It's not showing up as a big issue for them. So that's one way to look at it. You might have different ideas about the interpretation of the data, but it suggests to us that those norms aren't being challenged very much. And as I said, a very similar picture in science. Perhaps a slight increase in the extent to which mothers are inclined to see a problem in support of their institution. All right, here's another question from the survey, which asks, during the past 5 years, has your work been affected by your family or caring responsibilities in any of the following ways? So the responses reported here to missing opportunities for promotion or missing other opportunities for travel or conferences. All right, so here we see that mothers are much more likely than fathers to be reporting encountering those sorts of difficulties, and that's particularly strong around the opportunities for travel and attending conferences. It's stronger, that's a high proportion for both fathers and mothers, but you've got 2/3 or more of mothers reporting that sort of an issue. I think that just consolidates the sort of picture from the previous slide and previous observations, that mothers are the ones who are encountering these problems Yeah. And finally, just one more observation. So this is about respondents who indicated that they thought they might prefer a change in working arrangements. So think back to that flexibility issue that I was mentioning at the start. So if people had indicated that they might prefer a change in working arrangements, they were asked, well, which changes would you prefer and what happened if you asked? So here I'm just looking at responses to the option working reduced hours per week on an ongoing basis. I have noted there that the numbers are pretty low, so I'm expecting to take all this with great confidence. Certainly too low to break down for science, but still I think it's interesting and suggestive of some of those complexities around policies that I was talking about before. So what I think is interesting here is the much greater likelihood that men will be refused, or that fathers will be refused requests of this nature. So it says something about how institutions go about setting up policies. If the policies are there, are they really accessible? Accessible to whom? And perhaps what happens between the development of a policy at one level and how it's implemented by managers down the line, which is a common theme in the work-family policy literature, the role of line managers. All right, so those are just a range of snapshots from that research at this stage, and I think it opens up some questions for discussion. So Celine told me I had to put up have some questions and have some discussion time. So there are some that follow from the themes that I'll pursue here. With a strong emphasis on how can we make policies accessible to men, better accessible to men and usable to both men and women without some sort of penalty. And you can tell me what the specific barriers are in astronomy. And how do we think about that grander issue, the broader issue of what's happening in academic employment and its potential ramifications for these issues? So, over to you for answers to those questions.
Thanks so much, Jane. Are there questions or points of discussion? Chris.
Well, all of this does is reinforce my own prejudice that there's a real need for cultural attitudes amongst men to change. In my case, my wife would gestate our son, and she's the only one who breastfeeding. Everything else about childbearing, I'm perfectly capable of doing. And that was the arrangement we made. We had our son, and we both ended up working part-time for a number of years after he was born. And I don't see any reason why that should not be the norm. I still don't see why there's an expectation that women should be primary childcare.
But yeah, well, I want to agree with you, but I'm still saying that what's out there isn't quite.
And that's a big thing, changing cultural attitudes like that. Those things change their result.
Well, I think, any social issues change very, very slowly. But, there is change. I mean, you go shopping on Saturday morning, you see a lot of guys with their kids around. So I don't want to say there's no change. There is change, but the argument from the sociological perspective is more that change is much slower and harder than the sort of changes we've seen thus far about women's advancement from private to public sphere.
Okay, next question from Sarah.
Situation is my partner does not work as big, so although my situation is very makes childcare reasonably easy. It's not flexible, and so it's it actually having somebody outside acting.
Yeah.
That vision of the world is very much why would you do that?
No, I think that's a really good point, and it connects with some research that was done by Belinda Probert back in the mid-90s, and it was about the flexibility of academia and how it enabled women who became mothers, who were academics, to kind of bend their work around their parenting, and in doing so, remove the kind of need to renegotiate household labour, or, you know, the sharing of caring. And so it didn't necessarily require that they be married, that their partner be someone who wasn't in academia or had less flexibility than them. But it just meant that you didn't go through that process because you were accommodated to a certain extent. You didn't go through that process, so you ended up really consolidating those traditional arrangements of shared care or not shared care. So it's just interesting that it links up to that, and it shows you the minefield that arises when you start talking about flexibility, because it's a word that seems like, you know, it should be good for everyone, but there are traps and stigmas attached to them.
So this touches on what Sarah was saying as well. The statistic that really stuck out the most for me was that the number of women who felt impacted in their travel is huge. That's 2/3 of them feel like they are not able to travel locally. In this field in particular, that's a huge deal. So I think that maybe as a community we can look at that as a specific, we should try to address better, especially if you come up with site labor, we want that job applications. That is critical, especially in the phase. That's a barrier that we can break down. Sarah.
You probably know if it's I think it's in Norway where they have paid parental leave, and it was specifically initially for women, taking paid leave, but it's actually paternal leave, and so men should also be taking paternal leave, and of course in the beginning men wouldn't take leave, got to stay at work and get up there in grants. But someone else pointed out that I'm just going to offer you a year of free salary, you don't have to come to work, and that would be crazy not to take it. And then what started to happen is that the men were kind of forced to take that, and then within a very short period of time, the societal change occurred very quickly, because men and women took time off when their baby was born the first year, and then became more engaged with parenting and raising their kids, and it became less of a stigma at work to take that time off because it was part of the system of that country. So I wonder if you can say anything.
Yeah, sure. Look, there are huge debates around parental leave and its contradictory possibilities. So when parental leave first came on the scene and was largely maternity leave, it had that very division, you know, this is a great benefit for women, it will help them, they'll be more flexible, but it takes you out of the labour market, it consolidates your position as the carer, and that has all sorts of career implications. So particularly in the Nordic countries, the move towards parental leave rather than maternity leave has been undertaken in a particular way that sets aside a compulsory period. So it's like the daddy quota. So a couple will be entitled to a certain period of paid parental leave, and a certain amount will be set aside for the mother, the father. It will deal, I think they deal with, same-sex couples. So, but what they call the daddy quota is something that is lost to the family if, say, the father does not take it. So that has been the driver of that increase in fathers' use of parental leave. So Norway was the first country to do that in an extensive way, but it's gone on. It's very prevalent in the Nordic countries and in many European countries too. And you know, it's really a way we should be thinking about things.
Have you seen positive follow-ons in the workplace afterwards on both sides, for men and women, because of that?
Yeah, it's really hard to analyse, is what I'd say. But it was done with that intent. So the Nordic countries, well, Norway in particular, has addressed parental leave with a gender equality guide. And government's putting in parental leave do it for a whole range of reasons. It might be maternal and child health, you know, might be trying to encourage women's labour force participation. But the Nordic approach has been very much driven by the goal of gender equality. So,
Right. Well, Julie, we have an amazing data set here, so I'm curious, when we see the gaps between males and females, and for example, what the university is doing that's useful to them. So the guys are a bit ambivalent. That would be my reading of your data. The women are the opposite. They're not ambivalent. They see problems, and they see some good things as well. You have 11,000 responses. Can you break down and see what's working and what's not, if not in the past data, in the future data? That is, really see what people don't like, what's the missing bits, and what are the bits that they do like that's helping.
well, first thing, it's a cross-sectional study, so we don't really have the capacity to see what's working in that sense. It would be great if we could follow through and do that. And yes, there is capacity for disaggregation and to look in more depth at some of these things. The trouble is, once you start, here I've given you figures that are just for parents. So yeah, the bigger figure is for everyone. Once you start looking at parents, by discipline, by gender, and by people that respond to those sorts of questions about policies, your power starts to go down a bit. So we're a bit more limited than we'd hoped with some of those questions. This is a fairly surface description of it that I've given you here, and there's hopefully some more depth to come.
Okay, now the only thing keeping you all for lunch is
You showed on a slide earlier on those stats across the different work sectors, and they all seem to show the same trend on down. Starting point for science. It's just the starting point for science is worse. And so it's I'm drawing a conclusion from that we've got to get more people into that starting point, to that starting point, but also the solution is much broader than the science.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, no. I just wanted to give you a picture of where science as a group stood. And it is, you might take those figures and organise the disciplinary categories differently and get a somewhat different picture. But it's within science there. Yeah, it's the engineers.
Okay, so thank you for all of those good questions. And please thank Gillian for putting up the time to come and talk to us. The book is just Gillian will be here for the today and tomorrow. Is that right?
Yeah, I will be. Yeah,